Welcome to the Maliheh Paryavi podcast. I'm your host, Maliheh Paryavi. This season, I bring you real conversations with inspiring women leaders who are norm breakers and pioneers. Join my guests and I as we explore how to realize our dreams, become the leaders we deserve to be, and transform the world both within and around us. Our journey together begins right now. I'm at Harvard University visiting one of my favorite people, the amazing Bohnet. Iris, I must say, it's wonderful to be in your office and to see you and to be back on campus and not have a dissertation hanging over my head.
Well, lovely to see you as well, Maliheh. Good to have you back.
I did some digging through my emails the other day, and I found out that we first met on October 9th, 2007.
That's hard to believe. Yeah, wow. 11, 12 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, that is more than 11 years and
Mm-hmm.
thousands of emails ago. And during this time, we've taught courses together. We ran behavioral experiments and conducted research together. You were the chair of my dissertation committee, and you've been there for me through some of the most challenging times of my life. It dawned on me that I've never even seen you yawn or look tired or have an off day or be cranky or frustrated and or even a bad hair day. I've always seen you just joyful and sharp and present and focused and articulate and efficient. And I mean, I've always wondered, how does she do it? And on top of that, you're a professor, you travel all over the world and speak all over the world. You are co director of the Women in Public Policy program, you're the academic dean, you have 2 children. So I've been dying to ask you for so long, Iris, how do you do it?
I don't know. I don't know I have a good answer, Maliheh, but certainly your perception is also somewhat biased, I'm sure. I definitely have bad hair days, and I definitely have just generally bad days. Yes. So the question is, A, how you do it generally. I mean, how do you keep your kind of inner strength going? But also, and I'll actually start with the second observation, how do you keep going even if you don't feel so well, right? I think that's the other question because perception, of course, is not always reality. And I do think what's always helped me was to compartmentalize things. I'm very good at that. So even in my mind, I have drawers and things just have to go into drawers once in a while and you can't deal with them or think about them.
When you're in the office, you're in the office. Or if this is an hour, this is a research hour. Is that what you mean? I just want you to explain.
Yes, so I'm thinking more about kind of personal problems.
Okay.
I mean, as you know, recently my dad had a heart attack, and that's certainly a moment which you can't compartmentalize. I mean, I had a meeting with the dean and another dean just right after, and I cried. And so there are things that you just have to live in the moment, right? So in that you don't want to compartmentalize, and that's just you can't go into a drawer because there's no drawer that I can go into really. But what I do mean is, smaller things such as, maybe hectic morning or dropping off the kids late to school or something that is on one of my son's minds and that isn't urgent but still could occupy me for a while on, why is he feeling that way or things like that. So the smaller things of life, but still not unimportant things of life. So I can compartmentalize those. And basically, push them aside while I'm in the office and focus on the kinds of things that I need to focus on. I also do this with work in the sense that this is my hour to deal with revise and resubmit the paper, that we have to kind of look at and revise as we recently did. And that's just that hour. But then I have a next meeting at 11 and I just have to move on to the next meeting, which might be a faculty issue. And then I have to send whatever I have to my collaborators and move on and go into a different world. And I think I've been able to do this quite well and it's helped me.
And what do you do to sustain your energy? Or what do you do to take care of yourself?
You will be surprised, not really that much.
Okay, then we need to talk about this area.
But I draw a lot of energy from my family. And that sometimes is a surprise to people. In that, or I am surprised actually. I'm surprised sometimes by how people talk about their family or their children. they need time off from the family, or they send their kids to long camps, overnight camps, and that's really the time for them to relax and, replenish their batteries. I'm replenishing my batteries with my family. Tell you one more thing. I love swimming, so I do swim, so that's helpful. I am a swimmer. I love water. I love, love water. So that's another place where I definitely rejuvenate and get my energy and don't hear anything, don't think too much. You just kind of you in the water. I used to be a synchronized swimmer. So that's still very important for me, water. But thirdly, and that's related to water, and that might sound somewhat silly, but I take lots of baths in the evenings, and that's my time to really think about anything. I mean, very often I think about work, but it's fine. Work in a more generic sense, as in bigger thoughts. How could we revise the hiring procedures at the Kennedy School? How could we debias them close to my work? But bigger thoughts, not just how could I solve faculty member X's problem tomorrow? Or how could I write the op-ed that I promised?
More strategic
Yeah.
thinking. Yeah.
So I think those three things are really important. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, it's good to hear that you're making time for yourself and to take care of yourself, even though you have very limited time. And I think that's so important for other women to hear. And just making time for ourselves is really important to sustain our energy going forward and to be juggling all the things that, I mean, you're juggling. How do you manage, all the different hats you wear? Again, I think compartmentalization fits right into this. But, do you ever get overwhelmed?
Yes. I think the system that we have, I now specifically say we, my husband and I, works well in good times. And part of the secret, and I should have mentioned that even before, but part of the secret is just some luck. And I think I've also just had some luck in life. Luck as in health. Both our parents are still alive, they're growing older, and that's very stressful. That is very stressful for me too. So that's can be overwhelming. For me too, when they are in Switzerland, that's very overwhelming that you are far away and can't be there in important moments. And, also, I mean, I traveled quite a bit in the last 2 months because my dad wasn't well. That puts stress on kind of family here. So my life is not, stressless, but it has been quite manageable so far, also because of my partner. I mean, my husband and I kind of share responsibilities and negotiate a lot on, whose day is more important today when the kids are sick or when you have to take care of family members who can travel when. And yes, it's been working quite well for us so far. But one thing I try to do that's actually also important, I think, for my balance in life, I travel quite a bit, as you said. So I am gone quite a bit, but when I'm here, I try to avoid evening commitments as much as I possibly can. So I actually do have few evening commitments, and kind of having dinner together is very important for us. I love cooking. I should have mentioned that before too. I think I relax during that time too, and I can focus on the cooking, and it's pretty simple, and you chop the onions and the carrots, but you focus on that. I am academic dean for the second time around, and that's definitely an advice I give to your listeners. The first time around, I didn't include white space in my day. So now I'm much better at that. So my assistant includes white space. Every morning, I normally have half an hour to an hour, as you saw this morning, to do my morning email. So I can kind of have at least, or just evening morning email. So I have my first, 30 emails the first hour. And I typically have a bit of white space midday, then at the end of the day. So I'm trying to decrease the amount of time that I have to catch up in the evening because that can be stressful. Feeling like have to work until midnight to only have caught up on the day. And there's still a bit of that, for example, last night I did actually work a bit until like 10:30ish, and so my bath was late. But I'm doing much better at that.
I think one of the things that also helps sustain people, and last week I was talking to Angela Duckworth, who does research on grit and resilience, is, having a passion and having something that energizes you.
Mm,
And as someone who's worked with you, I feel like you either do
mm,
your work with a lot of joy or the work you do brings a lot of joy.
mm.
And I don't know if maybe it's both. What drives you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, my work definitely is my passion. I'm no question. Yes, I love my work. I love research. But I have to say, I derive joy from many things. So I think one of the advantages of being an academic is that the work can be very versatile. And there's many different things that you can do. And you can do research or you can write a book, as I did. And I love that. I love just writing for half a year, no meetings, very little email. I mean, really disappearing and just focusing on my book. Loved that. Then I loved and enjoyed the book tour, but up to a degree. Like after a year, you're kind of exhausted and you think like, well, there's the 25th interview, and you just feel like, okay, we kind of have to take a break, at least decrease the number of appearances, which I did. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed being kind of on stage and, yeah, giving lots of talks, and loved the fact that the book then was translated into different languages. And then, but then of course, expectations are that then you would go, to Spain and Latin America, but also to France and in Germany, and now it's in Japanese. And all of a sudden you can't. So, but again, I enjoyed that. But then you have to kind of do realize at some point you're like, okay, it's kind of compartmentalized. Has to go back into the drawer. You have to do something else. I love teaching, as you know. So I went back to teaching after the book, actually, and brought many of the insights from the book to a new course on behavioral science for organizations, which was a lot of fun to do. And now I'm back in as academic dean, kind of helping lead the school. And, that's probably the most stressful job of all of the jobs that I've had so far. As those of your listeners who are in managerial roles know, there's just a lot of problem solving, that you solve other people's problems. And that's not always joyful. I mean, it can be very stressful and frustrating. But I'm doing fine on that too. I mean, yes, I derive joy from that too. I mean, it sounds like strange. Of course, I don't derive joy from the stressful moments, and there are moments. I mean, just had a moment of kind of I was really angry last week, and it can be frustrating. But generally, I think I'm really blessed, and that's what my friends would say too. Including my female friends who, some have taken like a long break to be with their families and trying to rediscover, reinvent kind of their passion outside of their family life. Tell me that that's something that they admire, but also envy to some degree, that I have that passion, that I have this other life. And I'm passionate, as I said before, I'm passionate about my family too. I sometimes said, particularly in the beginning, when I had small children, I said that my children had given me a second life, which is true. I did actually think that my life was my work, and I loved my work so much, and I didn't even know I wanted to have children initially. My husband always wanted to and knew that I wanted to. So that's actually particularly bad. But I talked about this before we got married. I mean, we definitely had very explicit discussions. But anyway, he was pretty sure this would be coming when they did. Yeah.
Yeah, so as someone who's worked with you, I think it's very clear that you are really passionate about what you do. And even when you're advising students and when you're doing your research and giving your talks. And in the beginning of your career, though, you used to research a lot on the topic of trust.
Mm.
And how did you come to work on gender equality? And could you take me through the journey of how it evolved into you writing your book?
Yes. So I have been a behavioral economist kind of all my academic life. And I also would say I've been a feminist at heart all my life. But I hadn't brought the two together, in fact. And my work, as you say, was very focused on trust, collective decision making, negotiation, some cross cultural work as well. And I did also some, just a little bit on gender, as in just, common sense. You have to control for how men and women trust differently, or what affects men and women's trust, and maybe different interventions work for some and not for others. And so in that sense, I had done a little bit on gender, but not very much. And then, but I've always been passionate about gender equality, just not as a researcher. And it actually was the then dean, David Elwood, who asked me whether I would direct one of the Kennedy School's 12 research centers, the Women in Public Policy program. And that was just shortly after I had gotten tenure in 2006. And it came as actually quite as a big surprise to me, because my first reaction to him was, I haven't done feminist studies. I'm really not an expert, the question, quite as much. But I was also intrigued, and I'm not easily scared. So I'm kind of like to try out new things. And I also don't mind failing in that and moving on and, learning. In the end, I said yes. And I felt that I had something to contribute, but in fact, not what I ended up with. But I felt like, just with my research life and kind of understanding how a research center should function, and that should be a bridge builder between academics and the practice, and just many things that I kind of knew more on the kind of logistical end of things. I thought, like, I can implement that. And so the first year, embarrassingly, I kept two offices, which is kind of unheard of at the Kennedy School. Kind of thinking, okay, my academic life has to be here in this particular building, literally in the building that we're in now. My office was just one floor down. And I would move over and I would have a director's office in the research center and I would help set it up and get it off the ground and think about research fellows and seminars and working paper series and all the mechanics, basically. But I hadn't brought my intellectual self to gender yet. So it took me about a year. And luckily, this was at the same time where Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, two eminent behavioral economists, wrote a book that is called Nudge and was a bit of a game changer, I think, for many people in the field, in that that was a book that moved beyond behavioral economists had been doing thus far. Kind of behavioral economists had been focusing a lot on describing how people deviate from kind of the rational actor model prevalent in economics and kind of focusing on cognitive biases and the mistakes that people make in their judgments, etc. And that was very fruitful and very important, in particular because it enriched the model of human behavior in economics. But Nudge then moved this forward and said we can use those very same insights not just to diagnose what's happening, but also to help fix the mistakes that people make, and not just people, that organizations make, that we make in public policy, that we make in our management and leadership. And that really, I think, was an eye-opener for me. And all of a sudden, it became completely clear that I should be doing this for gender and that I should use those very same insights and help close gender gaps. And that started the second half of my research career. Really, maybe my first 10 years were devoted to questions of trust and cooperation and fairness. And the second half of my 20 years, the last 10 years, were very much focused on nudging organizations, people, and society towards more gender equality. And that eventually then led to me writing the book, What Works? Gender Equality by Design.
One of the motivations behind writing this book, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is to help level the playing field between men and women and to help get more women in leadership positions. Why is it so important to have more women in leadership positions?
Lots of reasons. I always start with the human rights case. So, I mean, we just have to remind ourselves that gender equality really shouldn't need a business case. Also, I'll talk about the business case too, but it really shouldn't need a business case. It just be a human right that men and women have equal opportunities in life, whether that's in economic participation or political opportunity or health or education or really any other field that you would think of. I mean, we all know this is not the case. I think the World Economic Forum now estimates that if nothing changes or if we just keep doing what we have been doing, it will take more than 100 years to level the playing field for men and women. So there's lots of work to be done in all parts of the world and in all areas, really. So that's my primary motivation, that I just think this human rights violation is a horrible thing, and in some cases is a matter of life and death for women, in that they don't have the same rights as their male counterparts. And in some other places, it's a matter of economic opportunity, financial stability in your life. So that's the primary motivation. Secondarily, there's a business case for gender diversity, and there's good evidence on collective intelligence. In fact, we now measure intelligence, or when I say we, it's a research team of Carnegie Mellon and MIT measuring intelligence of teams the way we measure individual intelligence. And we have the evidence to show that gender diverse teams outperform homogenous teams. And partly this, it seems to be the case that diverse teams are better listeners, in that if we don't just all agree or agree because of loyalty and therefore don't question each other's assumptions, we're just making better decisions. I mean, it also seems to be that women in particular, that's what that research also shows, women in particular have that social skill of listening and building bridges between different people. So there's a business case to have more women represented in our workforce, and of course, in particular, as you said, in positions of authority and leadership. And that has, additional side benefits, in that seeing is believing. And if we don't see women in leadership positions, our girls won't be able to imagine that they could be president or could study mathematics or could become an engineer at a tech company. So these role model effects are, in fact, well documented. A lot of evidence suggesting that they are quite powerful. And there's some really cool experiments ongoing right now as well in different parts of the world, actually. Let me talk about the French one, where one of my postdocs right now, Clementine von Effenterre, has looked at the effect of bringing female role models in STEM to high school classrooms in France. And this was a super light touch intervention. And then literally these role models only spend an hour with these high school students talking about their work, their life, and some of the same issues that we talk about now. And it turns out it affected career trajectories of the girls, not of the boys. It didn't, which is a good thing too. It didn't dissuade the boys or didn't in any way affect their ambitions, but it increased the girls' ambitions and it led to more girls self-selecting into STEM kind of majors. And that's a great thing. And there's not the only evidence. There's a number of these studies out there now suggesting that even relatively light touch, low cost types of interventions can matter. So there's good evidence out of India showing that having female political leaders at the local level, India was one of the first countries to take quotas very seriously and introduce reservations in Indian villages and reserve a third of village head positions for women. And so we have good evidence on the effect of that, again, on being role models for girls and their parents, and that many parents now identify core career aspirations for their daughters to become politicians. So clearly the role model effect is huge. So yeah, so for all of those reasons, we want to level the playing field. We want to have more women in all ranks, in all positions, in particular in the roles where they have been underrepresented in leadership. And I should mention, we need more men in counter-stereotypical roles as well. We need more male caregivers, and we need more male teachers in our elementary schools for our boys to also have role models.
So, what do you say to individuals, especially men, who view women advancing in any domain as a zero sum game?
First of all, we have to acknowledge that potential backlash is real. There is another whole literature on the myth of the zero sum mentality. In fact, my friend and colleague Max Bazerman has written about this for negotiations, that not specifically focusing on gender at all, but that mental barrier that we all have is to perceive too many things in life as zero sum, and that we're not creative enough in value creation. That's a term that we use in negotiations, that you shouldn't just haggle over the distribution of the fixed pie that we have in front of us, but really think about creative trades and how we could make the pie larger, and think about our relative interests. And you might care more about the price, and I might care more about the speed of delivery of some product. And so therefore I might compromise a bit more on price, and you might compromise more on time, and you give whatever you produce to me a bit earlier, and I pay a bit more. And that makes both of us better off. So that's the principle behind what you just described, in that this myth of the fixed pie. So I just wanted to highlight that this really is a bigger problem than gender. But of course, gender is part of that, in that men in particular, but people more generally, might not have the imagination or creativity to think of how to actually enlarge the size of the pie. Now, having said this, I do think both issues are real. So there are many cases where, as in collective intelligence, diversity actually makes the pie bigger. So we are more creative and more innovative in diverse teams. So therefore, by definition, we're making the available goods kind of bigger. So we are increasing the size of the pie. We are more productive. So that's the business case, the basis of the business case, really. But there are real and perceived instances of kind of a zero sum game. And let me talk about, some real instances and then some perceptions as well. And we have to take both seriously. The real cases, I was a bit involved, kind of wanted to learn more about a company, and that's all kind of public. So Deutsche Telekom was one of the first big companies, T-Mobile, for example, is part of Deutsche Telekom, to introduce gender quotas in senior management. And it happened, I don't know, 15 years ago now. So quite some time ago. and well-intentioned. And in the end, they kind of had to give it up. And they had to give it up because it just destroyed their culture in that there were too many men standing in line, having spent, I don't know, 15, 20 years at the company, expecting to be promoted to X. And then all of a sudden, the pie of X was in fact smaller. The pie of X decreased from what I'm going to call, I don't know, 90% of the seats available to men to now 75% of the seats available to men. And the 25% women, I don't remember now whether it was 25 or 30%, I should say, but between any 25 or 30% quotas for women, they were actually hard to find and weren't typically to be found within the company. So these were also external hires. So lots of lateral hires at senior levels just to meet the quota. Lots of people standing in line couldn't climb up the career ladder. So it was just really, really difficult to do. So these men, of course, and of course the German media was all over it, but these men did feel like this was unfair, that opportunities were taken away from them. So I do think in some cases, pies, at least in the short term, are limited. Now, one might argue maybe in the long term, the company could have been more productive, maybe it could have benefited from the benefits of diversity. But the short term consequences for the people then meant, I might be fired or I might not be promoted. So we have to think about that. Then there are perceptions, right? So there's reality and then there's perceptions. The perceptions are difficult to deal with. I mean, there are an increasing number, thankfully, of men's groups focusing on the identity of a man. And I know we're like being very binary here in gender identity, so definitely acknowledge that gender is not just binary. But for the sake of the argument, right now, I'm just going to make it easy on myself and talk about it as being binary for a moment. So just for example, research on what is called the masculinity threat. Yes, there are real expectations for manlyhood as well, defining what a man is and who men are by adding more women or decreasing the relative importance that men play in life, whether that's in the economy or also at home, in terms of being the primary breadwinner or not. Whether, again, real or perceived, is something to be taken very seriously. And, you and I, of course, and Alexandra van Geen, a third co-author of ours, do have a research paper, somewhat to our surprise, I think, at the time, kind of finding that this backlash can be very real.
So, what doesn't work and what does work in closing the gender gap in leadership?
It's quite funny. Until about half a year ago, I would have said diversity training doesn't work. I am updating that slightly. So at the time when I wrote the book in 2016, I could not find any evidence suggesting that diversity training had any positive impacts. I still think this is generally true. And even at the time, though, I said this might be because we haven't studied enough, and we haven't. Many companies just introduced diversity trainings and never measured the impact of it. That's definitely true. And, maybe somebody has come up with a diversity training that is a silver bullet and we just don't know. So I want to leave that open. But certainly as a behavioral scientist, there's reason to be cautious because in behavioral science, we have just generally not been great at debiasing mindsets. It's just super hard to do. And it's super hard to do because even good people like you, Maliheh, and I fall prey to these same biases. We fall into those traps. And it's hard to always have your super ego sit on your shoulders and whisper into your ears. And don't be surprised if the kindergarten teacher is male. And don't be shocked if the physician treating you is female. And the pilot. I mean, many of us have had that first time female pilot voice moment where we're like, oh, really? And then, hopefully for most of us, it happened very quickly that we were comfortable with it. But there are these first moments. That's why, even those of us who know about bias find it hard not to be affected by stereotypes. So that's why diversity training, I don't think, is going to be the end of the story. But I still wanted to tell you why I have a bit of better news at this point, in that a colleague of mine here at the Kennedy School, Michaela Carlana, a new assistant professor, has studied implicit association tests and the impact of sharing implicit association test results with people. And some of you might know what an implicit association test is. It's something you can also Google, by the way, or whatever search mechanism you want to use, implicit.harvard.edu, where you can learn a bit more about how we all respond to men, women, people of color, tall, small people, different religions. So I'm really, sadly, the world of bias is almost unlimited. But in any case, she administered the test to teachers in Italy, and she was interested in knowing whether bias or a gap, I should say, a gap in their grading of male and female students' exams encounters their typical subjects. So for girls, this was math, and also a gap in how teachers treated immigrants and Italians could be decreased or possibly even go away if these teachers are made aware that they have those biases. And that's exactly the experiment that she ran. So for half of the teachers, she informed them of the results of the test before they're graded, and the other half, she didn't inform them of the results of the test before they graded, and so she could see whether knowing this kind of made a difference, and it did. So it did have short-term impacts, and that kind of, raises my hopes a little bit, in that at least awareness raising can be a door opener. I mean, the other interesting thing, by the way, I should say, didn't work for everyone. It worked for people who previously in a survey had already indicated that they cared. Right? So for people who think gender inequality is just fine and women shouldn't have the same rights as men, kind of knowing that they treat men and women differently is just going to, yeah, that's who I am, and that's just fine. That's great. And she found that too. That for some people it was like, yeah, perfect, sadly. But for the others, it worked. So yes, so I do think there's some room for awareness raising, so for making people aware of their biases. But then, and this is, of course, is my main message and the main message of the book, is that we have to give people the tools then to do something about those biases. In the book, I go through the whole list of things, what organizations can do, kind of broadly speaking, both in their formal procedures. So think of human resource management, on how you recruit people, how you hire, how you do performance appraisals, how you promote. Kind of always looking for the best evidence out there on what can be done. And that's kind of a big chunk of the book. And then a much smaller part of the book, but an increasingly important part, I think, for our society, is the informal space of micro inequities, microaggressions, everyday behaviors, also the positive, like micro sponsorship, where we can help each other. Let me give you kind of a concrete example, because I think that's actually important to talk about, because everyone can do this, every day almost, in that the microaggressions that women and other traditionally discriminated against groups have experienced, such as not being given credit for a comment they make in a meeting or being interrupted, it's hard as an individual to do something about that in the moment and not being looked at when people speak to each other and just really feeling excluded. But we all can become micro-sponsors for each other. So for example, when I make comment and, the discussion moves on, and then 10 minutes later, John, in so many words, repeats what I said or kind of picks up on my idea, maybe also unconsciously kind of picks it up and then is given credit for the comment or for the idea, Maliheh can bring this back to me and basically say, John, I'm so happy you built on what Iris just said before, because I kind of felt that we moved on too quickly and we should really bring it back and kind of just learn from Iris what she had in mind when she raised that issue. And I do that kind of vigilantly now in meetings, really making sure that people are heard, and also giving people voice. Some these small things, often these nudges that the book is really focused on, are small tools, small techniques. Sometimes technology can help. So one company I work with just have a little rule now that whoever joins by VC, by video conference from outside of the United States, gets to speak first, because it's harder to have your voice heard as compared to when you're in your room and things like that.
All of this gives me so much hope. This is amazing, like the work you're doing, and I know we still have ways to go, but I've also been thinking a lot about what else is also required to promote gender equality. And as you know, I believe that having more women in leadership is only the beginning, and we need to also make sure these women are supported and they have the support they need to really thrive. And that's what inspired me to start my leadership advisory practice. One of the things I want to ask you is, who supports you? Like, who do you go to for advice? Who do you brainstorm with?
Many people. And I think it's helped me enormously in my life, in that I've asked all kinds of different people for help on all kinds of different issues. So there are days when I sit in my office here and reflect with my executive coordinator and my chief of staff, Nicole Carter Quinn and Kelsey Harul, about, we talk about work, and all of a sudden I'm like, I'm struggling with this. Help me. What advice would you give me? That totally happens a lot. And then there are important figures in my life, such as my parents, and in particular my dad, who have always been people I would call up when something big happened. I mean, certainly, I think I'm maybe a bit calmer with myself, or have a bit more self confidence now than as a young person. But I remember when I came here, my first year as an assistant professor at the Kennedy School, my husband was still in Switzerland. All my family was in Switzerland, and I didn't know anyone. That was a tough year. And there were moments when I had to call my dad up, like in the middle of the night in Switzerland, because of 6 hours time difference, because I needed to talk something through. And then, of course, my husband is somebody now who I ask small things, big things a lot. I even, ask my kids for help. Honestly, I ask them for advice on how to do things. I've had mentors at the Kennedy School. Richard Zeckhauser is a senior faculty member here at the school. Jenny Mansbridge, senior faculty member, and I've asked them. But I don't. That's what I'm saying. I have this very diverse network, loose network, where also my different advisors don't know each other, or my different people I turn to for advice. Hannah Riley Bowles is another good friend and colleague. Kathleen McGinn. These are very good friends, and then I turn to them. It's almost random would be the wrong word. I mean, it's not. I don't literally throw the dice, and who should I turn to? But I think whoever I am close to that moment, or has most expertise, or just seems natural to ask. But I think I've never been shy, and people have actually commented on that, and I think I mentioned it before, but I'm a good learner. I'm not scared to ask for help.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important message for other women to hear too, because a lot of times they feel if they ask for help, it's showing a weakness. But I think it takes tremendous strength and self awareness to really reach out and ask for help. In addition to having more women in leadership and supporting them, I believe we need to also make sure that these women feel empowered and equipped to really be forces for real change. The reality, at least in my mind, is that we have inherited a world that was originally designed and built by men for men. So I have an idea that I want to run by you. I hope by sharing this, we can start a conversation and encourage ourselves and anyone who will be listening to this to use our imaginations and think about what the world would look like if it was designed and built by women, or what I call a women designed world. This isn't about excluding men or abolishing or abandoning the current system altogether. Imagining a woman designed world is an exercise to help us sort of move beyond the status quo, identify the gaps, and find ways to add to the system that is inclusive and will enrich everybody's lives. And it's about really achieving a higher level of awareness and a more complete way of coexisting and being as a society. So I just wanted your thoughts on that and see if you have any ideas of what a woman designed world would look like. Because as someone who's worked in this field for a long time and I've thought about gender issues my whole life, I don't really know. But the fact that there's a 9 to 5 workday and school ends at 3 p.m., or we never talk about menstruation in offices, and I don't know a single woman who wouldn't want a day a month to work from home, and these kind of things. Like, what can we do to really push the boundaries? Like, for example, in Vienna, like, policymakers started looking at men and women use the public transit system, and they increased the lighting and to make it safer for women to walk at home. They widened the sidewalks to make it easier to use the sidewalk with strollers, and it's about these kind of things and really trying to push our imagination to think outside. Because if we have women who are in leadership, but they're still kind of going with the existing system, I want them to feel that they have the agency and they are also empowered to be designers of the world. I just would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's a huge question. I am an empirical researcher. So let me kind of reframe the question that you asked for a moment and talk a bit about what evidence do we have that if women were in power, that they would in fact do things differently. Right? Which, of course, in itself is already a difficult question because even if women are or gain power, and my example is actually going to be suffrage and political power, the dominant ideology and the institutions and the way to power is kind of still through men. So I'm not saying it's not a perfect experiment, but it's close, I think the closest evidence that we do have. And yes, it's a very big question, I think, for many people and many researchers as well. Do women, in fact, have different preferences than men? And yes, we do have some evidence on that, which, shouldn't be particularly surprising in that when women gained suffrage in the US, spending on healthcare increased. So women seem to be caring about certain topics such as healthcare or education that are closer to women's lives, women's experiences more than their male counterparts. There's other evidence from the India experiment that I talked about before, which is very good evidence suggesting that female mayors or pradhans did in fact spend more money on clean water because getting water is a woman's job in India, and that often meant walking 4 hours or longer per day, and is also, as we now know, a primary determinant for babies' health. Because babies obviously are the most vulnerable, and then if they are exposed to dirty water early on, that affects their survival chances enormously. So it's mothers because they're close to their babies, but also it is women because it's kind of their job that they were thinking about water. And then water led to streets. And how do you get to the well? And, that can, as you said, in Vienna, but also in African countries, that can lead to light because women also have to worry about not just the time they spend, but also the safety and all that. So yes, I do believe that women and men, because of their experiences, can have different priorities. And that can translate into political choices or other choices that women make. We also do know that demand for flexibility is more pronounced among women than among men. But, as I'm saying this, I just want us to be cognizant that I'm not saying this is necessarily the biology or nature that drives those differences, but women might just care more about flexibility because the lion's share of the care work is still being done by women. And if that was split 50-50, who knows? Maybe men would care equally as much about flexibility, or women would care less about flexibility. So I think that is one of the distinctions that we have to make, and that is very hard to make. I'm not suggesting I have the answer in that some of the differences that we see today in men's and women's choices are due to the environment, the different environment, the gendered environment that men and women face. And, if women didn't have to care more about or were more vulnerable to dark alleys, women might not care about light as much. So I don't think there's an intrinsic reason why women care about light and men don't. But then, you might want to push me more, and that's where I think the waters are more treacherous in that are there intrinsic differences? Are there, in fact, differences due to nature? And I don't know. Maliheh, I don't know. I often say that, as long as the environment is so different, well, we don't know. So let's equalize the playing field. Let's create equal opportunities for men and women. And then I'm super happy to let the chips fall where they may. And women might choose differently and might lead differently. I mean, there's evidence that women lead more democratically, more collaboratively. But then again, the same researchers would say, but this might be because women want to lead more collaboratively and democratically. That's totally a possibility. Or it might be that women have learned that they experience social backlash if they violate the stereotypes that we have about women, that they have to be more collaborative and warmer and care more. And they can't afford to lead like men can afford to lead assertively. So that's why, your question is like in utopia, if women really had free reign and could do it their way, it's very hard to predict, unconstrained, right? Because they're so constrained now, so everything we see is given the constraints they face. So in an unconstrained world, I don't know. I'll give you one last example, and that's the Kasi in India. So this obviously is a huge research question that you're asking me about, and then there have been researchers who went to matriarchal societies and patriarchal societies, kind of understand a bit about the social norms that might have emerged differently given those traditions. And yes, the Kasi in India, which is a matriarchal society, is actually quite different from even Americans or the typical Western societies that people have been studying thus far. In fact, the women are more competitive and more assertive than their Western counterparts in those matriarchal societies. So just goes to show that women can afford to play the game slightly differently in a different type of leadership environment than we're in.
Yeah, and it's mostly, I feel like my goal with this is just to start that conversation and get women to think about the possibility of even behaving differently or leading differently, because oftentimes they do get into these leadership positions and they feel like they need to conform to the existing norms, or the role models they've seen were men, so many of the women leaders that I work with, they've never even seen other women leaders ahead of them, before them, so that is their sort of reference point. So just pushing them to think beyond that. And, like one of my clients, when we started having these conversations, one day she's like, I'm going to go on a business trip, and I decided to take my son with me. I never even thought about it. And she took her son on the trip. They had a great time. He sat in on all her meetings and saw his mother presenting and working. And it really, you could think about changing biases and worldviews and mindsets. It can start at such a young age. And they had a lot of fun together. She also wasn't feeling guilty that he wasn't there and what he was doing when she was away. She could focus on her work more. This is just one very small example, but just getting that conversation going and encouraging women to really, and men, to really think outside of what currently exists.
There's research supporting the example that you just gave, in that sons of professional women tend to care more about gender equality than their counterparts. It's also true that fathers of daughters care more about gender equality than fathers of sons, sadly. But just I think what you're talking about is, learning is experiential. So you have to see it to believe it. You have to feel it to be able to do it. You have to hear her or him kind of say it, to imagine that's possible for you too. So yes, so these experiences are well documented and they do matter.
Wonderful. So, Iris, thank you so much for joining me. This has been such an enriching conversation. And as always, it's great to see you. And thank you so much for all your kindness and support throughout the years. Like, I don't even know how to put it in words. So,
well, you're too generous, Maliheh. I mean, thank you for doing this and this podcast and advising and coaching women kind of on their leadership journey, and for being a role model yourself.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to the Maliheh Paryavi podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and subscribe to my newsletter on my website for more inspiration and support. Until next time, be well and keep on shining.